Being around Shoshana is like being at an auction. A chance twitch or remark, and you discover you've made an unexpected and often significant commitment. About 10 years ago, I mentioned to Shoshana that Michelle and I had visited celebrated Israeli author and rabbi Chaim Sabato, who's been called the Agnon of the Sephardim. And before I knew it, I had led several sessions on Sabato's work for this amazing Chug Agnon, including one that included a screening of an interview that I did with him in Hebrew.
That was fascinating.
Well, having forgotten the hazards of posing casual questions to Shoshana, I recently asked her whether she'd read Anthony David's book, The Patron. And so tonight I'm here to discuss Agnon's relationship with someone whose background and outlook could not be more different from Sabato's. The passionately secular Yeka Zalman Schocken. Now, I'll divide our session into 3 parts. Part 1, we'll briefly outline Zalman's life story, focusing on how, paradoxically, in all his diverse spheres of interest and influence, he was a pioneering force and yet also a quintessential outsider. Second, we'll trace the arc of Zalman's relationship with Agnon and identify 5 ways in which he was Agnon's patron. And finally, we'll turn to Agnon's view of his patron, dipping into his final posthumous novel, In Mr. Lublin's Store, and conclude with some comments on Zalman's legacy. Now, to give you some breaks during our session, and in case you'd like to ask a question along the way, I'll pause after each of these parts and ask if you have any questions. We can take a little break. And so to part 1, Zalman's life story. Zalman has been variously described as a businessman with art in his soul, a theoretician among merchants, and a man of action among scholars, and a Don Quixote of the jet age. And yet, as Anthony David puts it in a biography which may itself be as controversial as its subject, the memory of a man who had created a vast marketing and media empire faded quickly. He became an infrequent footnote in scholarly monographs dealing with the history of German Jews. How did this happen? So, the Schocken story begins in the 1830s when a storekeeper named Avraham settled in the village of Schocken in the Polish province of Posen and took the name of that village as his family name. Can you see the map?
Mm-hmm.
I hope so. So you'll see there on the right side, I don't know if you can see where my cursor is, but there's a little village called Schocken, which is the village of Schocken, otherwise known as Schocken. And in the late 1840s, sensing the economic possibilities to be opened up by revolutions across Europe, he moved his family east to the village of Margonen. It actually looks like he's moving it north, but maybe this map is slightly angled. So Margonen was actually east. There, Abraham's son, Yitzchak, also a storekeeper, had 10 children, the youngest of which, born in 1877, was named Zalman. After 4 years at elementary school, Zalman Schocken was apprenticed at age 14 to a schmatter business in Gnesen. And apologies if I'm pronouncing these names incorrectly. Gnesen, by the way, if I move my cursor along, is down there at the bottom corner there, in the right. As a teenager, Zalman developed a passion for books and was reading John Stuart Mill, Spinoza, Kant, Schopenhauer, and Emerson. And many years later, one of his Nisan friends reminded Zalman how in those days they lived deeply within books, devoting their inner souls to the literary, the intellectual, and the beautiful. But Zalman's passion for self-education had already made him an outsider to the other apprentices, and his boss lost patience with his daydreaming, his reading on the job, his eye-rolling, and denunciations of the corrupt bourgeoisie. And so, at age 17, Zalman moved on to Berlin. So Berlin is right over here. And then to Leipzig, and finally to Zwickau, a German town in southwest Saxony, where he helped his older brother, Simon, run a department store. There's Simon and there's Zalman. Simon was practical and intuitive, with an instinct for what his customers, the housewives, needed. Zalman was the strategist, the planner, the organizer. Zalman once recounted how a business friend suggested that he join an elegant fashion house in Dresden. Zalman laughed us off, saying, "I had a vision. I saw myself at 60 in a dark shop with a piece of silk in my hand, asking a customer, 'Will this be the right shade, madam?' What I meant is that I like to have a business where there are no customers who demand, 'Where is the boss? I want to talk to him.'" We will see how Agnon picks up on this in Mr. Lublin's store. Anyway, by the time Simon died in a car crash in 1929, the brothers had together grown their business to 20 Kaufhaus Schocken stores, one of the largest department store chains in Europe. To design 3 of their iconic modernist buildings, Zalman had hired German Jewish architect Erich Mendelsohn. Mendelsohn was one of the world's top architects at the time and founder of the International Style. And the Nuremberg store was completed in 1926. It was later demolished. The Stuttgart store was completed in 1928. It was demolished in 1960. An amazing picture, I think, when you think about it, a store like this in 1928. And the Chemnitz store, which still survives today, was completed in 1930. And today it is Saxony's State Museum of Archaeology. Mendelssohn stripped department stores of chandeliers, grand marble staircases, high neo-Gothic gilded ceilings. He replaced Aryan Germanic verticals with elegant horizontal plans, sleekness, efficiency, and rationality, which reflected the core values on which Zalman built the Schocken chain. As Zalman's son, was called Gustav and then Gershom, wrote about his father a decade after Zalman's death, he did not invent the modern department store, but he democratized it for the common man. He brought low price, high quality merchandise to the lower and working classes in small towns, and in so doing, he revolutionized German habits of consumption. So there's a fascinating scene in Naomi Shorey's film documentary on Zalman. And I recommend it to you to see this documentary, which was produced recently. The documentary is called Schocken on the Verge of Consensus. And the scene takes place in the Chemnitz store, where Shorey films an interview with a group of young German students sitting in what was once the Schocken store and discussing what they heard about Zalman from their grandparents. One student said, "It's not that income wasn't important to him, but he cared about people. In contrast," this young man says, "in contrast to today's world, where everything important is about money and employees are just instruments." Now, Zalman's management of the business through the 1930s would be a compelling topic for a session on its own. As his lawyer, Siegfried Moses, who managed some of the Schocken stores, he managed the Zwickau store in the 1920s and later became Israel's first state controller, describes it. At first, when the Nazis came to power, there were few interferences in the business, but gradually the difficulties increased, and in 1936, Zalman brought 2 English businessmen onto the board, and one became a partner. Zalman helped his Jewish employees emigrate, including training them in agriculture at the Schocken family's training farm. When systematic boycotts of Jewish shops began in 1938, Zalman sold the company to a German banking group at a steeply discounted price. And after the war, he claimed restitution and was given 51% ownership after lengthy negotiations. But by then, the East Germans had nationalized the former headquarters in Zwickau and all the East German stores. The remaining company, which was renamed Merker, comprised the West German stores and the headquarters in Nuremberg and had far less financial independence than before the war. But the internal organization of the firm and its ways of buying and selling remained essentially the same as always. In 1953, Zalman sold his share for a fraction of its value to a German department store company. So that's a little synopsis of the way Zalman dealt with the store chain through all those decades. Meanwhile, Zalman applied the same creativity, focus, and passion to his wide-ranging cultural interests as he did to business. In 1930, he set up the Schocken Institute for Research on Hebrew Poetry to publish Jewish poetry as foundational literature modeled on the German epic poem, the Nibelungenlied. In 1931, he founded the publishing company Schocken Verlag, which made books by German Jewish writers widely available. After 1933, the importance of the Verlag was heightened by the exclusion of Jews from German cultural life. It published a diverse range of over 250 books, and the Nazis shut down the Verlag at the end of 1938. Meanwhile, Zalman amassed a personal library of 60,000 manuscripts and rare books, reputed to be one of the world's largest Judaica and Hebrew collections, and we'll come back to this in a little while. As with economics and as with culture, Zalman brought his unique vision and prodigious energies to a third sphere, Zionist politics, where he would experience his greatest frustrations and disappointments. From his speeches at his very first Zionist conferences from 1912, his approach was regarded as idiosyncratic. At the 1925 Zionist Congress, he proposed a special executive to oversee all economic matters free from party influence. But it took over 2 decades until this proposal was implemented, when the Jewish Agency finally appointed a controller in 1946. As a member of the agency's board of governors a century later, I have little doubt that Zalman would experience a similar level of frustration with the organization today. In 1933, Zalman moved with his family to Jerusalem, and he transferred the Institute for Hebrew Poetry to his library there on Balfour Road. From there, he worked intensely on transferring the property of German Jews through Ha'avara Company in the face of widespread opposition by those who viewed it as a form of collaboration with the Nazis. And Zalman played a key role in the drawn-out negotiations for the acquisition of Haifa Bay by Keren Kayemet. He doggedly fought the Keren Kayemet bureaucracy. He loaned his own funds, and ultimately he was successful in that Keren Kayemet acquired this critical cornerstone for the development of Haifa and northern Israel. In 1935, Zalman bought the Haaretz newspaper, and in 1937, he set up the Schocken Publishing House Limited in Palestine. And yet, as Sigrid Moses points out, the expectation that Zalman would make extensive private investments in Palestine after immigrating there did not generally come true. Among the many aspects of his Zionist activity, what most captivated Zalman's imagination was the Hebrew University. And in 1935, he became chairman of its executive council. Some of the university's most iconic buildings, like Hadassah University Hospital by Eric Mendelsohn, were the results of his initiative. He summarized his involvement in a 1940 speech to the American Friends of the Hebrew University, where he said, "For the past 5 years, I've been engaged in the everyday work of the university with the same seriousness as if it were my own business. There's hardly a task in our world which can lend wings to our imagination and our striving for the future, as does the idea of a Hebrew university on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem." And while on that fundraising tip, he impulsively decided to remain in America, and there he established Schocken Books, Inc., which was acquired by Random House in 1987, itself ironically acquired by the German media conglomerate Bertelsmann in 1998. But his impulsive decision to live in America during the war caused him to lose the control of the university administration and estranged him from the Jewish community in Palestine during the war years. Siegfried Moses poignantly describes Zalman's final years like this: "What was left to him after this decisive change was still enough to enrich and fill a life, if measured by the average standards, by the standards of the average person in his 60s. But according to Zalman's standards, the occupations left to him could not but be frustrating. His vitality, his thirst for knowledge, and his capacity for enjoyment remained unaffected, and his personal activity was great for many more years." In 1950, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America gave him an honorary doctorate, to which, by the way, the family gifted the Schocken Library after Zalman's death. So their generosity was rewarded, despite the frenetic efforts that the Hebrew University made to obtain that library. And Zalman busied himself with his studies, his books, and his art. And in his final years, he also passionately took up interests in music and in Greek coins. Yet, in spite of all these activities, Moses relates, there was a growing feeling of loneliness, of doubt, whether he was genuinely close to his own epoch, close to the people with whom he lived. After the establishment of Israel, he several times considered the possibility of moving again to Jerusalem. It grieved him that in this decisive period of the country, he could not take an active part in its developments. He submitted proposals to the Israeli government with a view to, for example, to stabilizing the Israeli pound, but these were rebuffed. Yet even at a time when active decisions could hardly be expected any longer, the wealth of his vivacious, fascinating, and charming personality, these are Moses's words, and undiminished to his last days, still retained its spell on those who came in close contact with him. Zalman died while vacationing at a resort in the Swiss Alps in 1959. Professor Steve Asheim comments that the manner of his death was symbolic, almost theatrical. He was slumped in his chair, a volume of Faust II in one hand and Rabbi Nachman's stories clutched firmly in the other. He left 4 sons and a daughter, and the family has played a central role in Israel and the Jewish world, with Gershom, the eldest, succeeding him as head of the Schocken publishing company in Tel Aviv and the Haaretz newspaper, and of course, Gershom's son, Zalman's grandson, Amos, is head of Haaretz today. And yet, Zalman always remained the quintessential outsider. From the time he started his business as an Ursteward in Zwickau, Germany, to his marriage to Lily Ehrman, whose old-line Frankfurt German Jewish family looked down on him, to his snubbing within both the German and the broader Jewish communities in Palestine, to his alienation from the nationalistic militarism of the Israeli establishment, and to the strangeness of America, where he spent his final years. Towards the end of his life, he summed it up thus: I must remain an outsider in order to be faithful to myself. Loneliness is the price which has to be paid for this, but it's worth it. Now, one concrete way to highlight Zalman's position as an outsider is to consider the location of his home and his library in Jerusalem. I hope you can see there a little map. You'll see where the cursor, the pink cursor is. That's the Schocken Library at 6 Balfour Road. And opposite, just opposite there, if you look a little to the right, is on the corner of Smolensky Street and Balfour is the Villa Schocken. Now, in the opening lecture of the Schocken Institute's 2019 conference, recent conference, you can see it on YouTube, Dr. Thomas Spar points out that the Schocken Villa and Library are at the seam between Rehavia and Talbia, just inside Rehavia's boundaries. When Zalman lived there in the Villa Schocken, opposite, across the road, of course, was what is now the Prime Minister's house. And then it was the Foreign Minister's house, and the Golda Meir lived there. And Anthony David says, compared to Golda's house, Zalman's house and library, like his humanism, looked like a fossilized relic from a different era. Its clean, modernist appearance, there you have it. Its clean, modernist appearance announced his belief in universality, simplicity, and rationality, all entirely out of step with the nationalist mood of the 1950s. By then, Zalman had become increasingly critical of Israeli politics. More than anything, he hated the bugle sounds and the flag waving of military parades. The Israeli government, he said, hasn't a clue that there is something to see in the Schocken Library. Now, the Schocken Villa, which was designed by Eric Mendelsohn, and by the way, here's the library across the road, and it's still there like that. But the villa, back to the villa, which was designed by Mendelsohn and originally was surrounded by 1.5 acre garden. there in the center of Jerusalem, is still one of Jerusalem's most important buildings. In 1957, it was sold to the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance. And over the years, there have been various proposals to demolish it, but it's protected as a heritage building. A recent redevelopment plan was approved and has drawn vocal opposition from experts around the world. And meanwhile, in November of 2019, just before the pandemic, the press reported on a creeping takeover of the property by Netanyahu, who renovated it at public expense in preparation for Putin's delegation that Netanyahu housed there just before the pandemic, right there in the Villa Schocken. And I think although neither Spar nor anyone else, as far as I know, has mentioned it, the contrast between Rechavia and Talbia and the location of the Schocken library at the seam between them is a powerful metaphor for the dichotomy in Zalman's personality and outlook. Developed in the 20s and 30s by affluent Christian Arabs, Talbia is a neighborhood of wide, meandering boulevards, graceful, elegant homes with Renaissance, Moorish, and Arab architectural motifs, surrounded by trees and flowering gardens. Apologies if I'm a little biased. Constantine Salome built his iconic villa there since 1948. It's the home of the Belgian consul. More recently, the landmarks include the Jerusalem Theater, the Van Leer Institute, and Beit HaNasi, the official residence of the President of Israel. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the layout, architecture, and ambience of Talbia reflect eclectic, open, diverse, cosmopolitan, and perhaps pluralistic sensibility. Rechavia, on the other hand, developed around the same time and based on a typical German garden city, has always been closely associated with the German Jewish community. The streets are generally quite narrow, very orderly, housing functional and utilitarian, with an emphasis on the international style. The Rechavia community was, and I believe is, less diverse than Talbia, and in Zalman's time, it appears to have been quite closed and snobbish and very gossipy. Zalman, as patron, publisher, and personality, and his library have long been emblematic of German Jewish Rechavia. And yet, as in Germany and in Israel generally, Zalman was the outsider in Rechavia. He was deeply stung by its gossip and condescension, and he was frustrated by many of its norms and opposed to its prejudices. And I can't help thinking that he and his library would have been more at home one house over on the Talbia side of the sea. Anyway, that's my outline of Zalman's story and a little bit about his personality and where he lived when he was in Jerusalem. And I'm going to pause there and ask, as I mentioned before we go into the next section, when we talk about the relationship between Zalman and Agnon, if you have any questions about Zalman. Don't ask about Agnon, because we're going to come to that momentarily. So
you mentioned that when he died, he was found with two books by his side. One was Rab Nachman of Bratslav, and what was the other one?
The other one was Faust II by the great German writer Goethe, who was really Zalman's icon. And, we'll come to this in a moment, but, he really encouraged Agnon to read Goethe. And the way that it's portrayed, whether this is there's some legend here, but the way it's portrayed is that in the spa, in the Swiss Alps, one of the staff in the spa found him slumped at his desk when he had this heart attack and died. And it actually wasn't by his side. He was still clutching in his hands these two books, which of course is deeply symbolic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Not a question, just a comment. Many years ago, I was privileged to have a 1 hour plus, how do you call it? Just looking at the manuscripts at the
Schocken Library.
and the early prints, and somebody didn't know who I wasn't. So he gave me the deluxe tour.
I'm going to, against that backdrop, turn to the relationship between Zalman Schocken and Agnon. Now, you know, as a self-styled Jewish Medici, Zalman had many proteges, including the philosophers Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem, the poets Else Lasker Schuler and Karl Wolfskel, forgive my pronunciations, and as we've seen, the architect Eric Mendelssohn, just to mention a few. But he had a unique relationship with Agnon. Zalman was introduced to Agnon in 1915 in Berlin by Buber and Leo Hermann. Agnon was 11 years younger than Zalman. Zalman immediately liked Agnon, and he asked him to become his personal Hebrew teacher and moved to Zwickau. At that point, Agnon was in Germany and in Berlin, and Zalman was still in Zwickau. Agnon wouldn't leave Berlin, but he was fascinated with Zalman, who came from a small eastern shtetl like himself. He had built a huge business empire and was also steeped in German literature and philosophy. And Zalman agreed to pay Agnon a monthly retainer and help him access European publishers. Now, after the First World War, Agnon moved to Leipzig and then to Bad Homburg in Frankfurt, near Frankfurt, where Zalman's monthly and steady stream, monthly retainer, and that he paid to Agnon, and the steady stream of free books allowed Agnon to live a comfortable life. When Agnon married in 1920, Zalman gave him the pick of his department stores: furniture, clothing, food, supplies. And when Agnon returned to Palestine in 1924, he wrote to tell Zalman he was thinking of opening a small shop in Tel Aviv to support himself. I don't know, Shoshana, if you've in over the years you've discussed this, and whether it was a ploy of Agnon's to get Zalman's attention. And if it was, it worked. Zalman wrote to Agnon and he said, your proposal's nonsense, total nonsense. It really makes no sense for you to be forced into a career in trade. I implore you to open up to me. Just imagine you're in my library, sitting opposite me in peace and quiet, pouring out all the troubles of your heart. And now already Agnon is back in Palestine, and Zalman is in Germany. Zalman promised him enough money to live for a year, worry-free and not in undue poverty. Now, until he started publishing Agnon himself, Zalman worked hard to find Agnon a publisher. In 1919, after a Danish Jewish publisher declined due to the precarious post-First World War financial situation, Zalman persuaded Agnon to move to Munich and to collaborate with Sigmund Freud's niece on a Hebrew primer for Jewish schools. Agnon was not happy to move to this hotbed of violence. In the late 1920s, Zalman decided to start publishing Agnon's collected works himself. This would be the first publishing venture of the Schocken publishing house. And in 1930, Agnon returned to Germany to finalize publication of his collected works to that point. And Zalman viewed this project as his greatest achievement to that point in 20 years of Zionist activity. In 1935, Agnon immersed himself in assembling a collection on Pesach and the Yamim Noraim at Zalman's request. And Zalman was thrilled, and he raised Agnon's retainer to £35 a month. That's what it was at that point in the mid-1930s, along with a full-time secretary and a typewriter. Zalman started negotiating with Doubleday in New York for English translations of Agnon's work, and he launched an international campaign to make his writer a world figure. In 1937, Haaretz published A Guest for the Night in 39 installments. It also published excerpts from Days of Awe, which Agnon dedicated to Zalman for giving him the spiritual impetus for the book. And the book was offered, Days of Awe was offered complimentary to all new subscribers to Haaretz. During the Second World War, Agnon remained Schocken's premier writer. And Gershom, who was then in charge, because as I mentioned, Zalman was by then living in America, in consultation with Zalman, he raised Agnon's salary to £420 a year. He supplied him with materials to help finish his novel Only Yesterday, the first installment of which appeared in the newspaper in 1944. Gershom viewed Agnon as Schocken property, and he got into a spat with Beryl Katzenelson over an article of Agnon's that Beryl wanted to publish through Oved, the publishing house that Katzenelson ran. And in the end, Zalman stepped in and settled the matter. Meanwhile, Zalman was so impressed with Tzemol Shel Shalom that he relaunched an initiative to get Agnon a Nobel Prize. And this, of course, is a very important initiative. He assembled a powerful lobbying team, including the chief rabbi of Sweden, the Hebrew University representative in Stockholm, the Swedish representative in Cairo, Hugo Bergman, Baruch Kurzweil, the Schocken library head, Avraham Haberman at the time, and the manager of Schocken Books in Tel Aviv, Joseph Herman. And they all agreed that the campaign needed to be spearheaded by the Hebrew University. And Bergman turned to Josef Klausner, who at that point was the most powerful man in the Department of Hebrew Literature, to assist. But Klausner refused to sign the letter in support of what he called a provincial writer of Galician folk tales. And of course, this story is well known. The antipathy between Agnon and Klausner, and of course Amos Oz, who was Klausner's nephew, wrote about this extensively. It appears that the right-wing Klausner effectively killed the initiative because Klausner detested the way that Agnon depicted Jewish exile. And the refusal of the Department of Hebrew Language at the university to back Zalman's efforts to get the Nobel for Agnon really were a sign of Zalman's waning influence at that point. But there were ups and downs in Zalman's relationship with Agnon until the end. In Zalman's later years, there were long periods when their correspondence lacked the intimacy that they had in the correspondence in the earlier years. And this appears to have really deeply saddened Zalman. In 1950, for example, he wrote, "My dear Agnon, it's been precisely 33 years since you came to visit us in Zwickau as a shy boy. I can still see you as Gustav bouncing on your knee and how you drew him a picture of a small bird in a tree. It's always been a special gift for me to be with you, whether speaking, listening, or in silence. There was never anything we hesitated to say or think to one another. Our relationship was always truthful, beautiful, and human." But by this stage, Agnon may have felt he had somewhat outgrown the non-material part of Zalman's patronage, and he didn't reciprocate the warmth. But then in 1951, as Agnon had a heart attack, and Zalman sent him doctors, he sent him books, a long letter, and a blank check. I insist you tell me what you need, he wrote. And the warmth returned briefly. Agnon returned to Israel, where Gershom visited him and reported to Zalman that Agnon needed a telephone. Now he was living in Talpiot. And in the early 1950s, a telephone was extremely difficult to obtain in Israel. Zalman contacted Ben Gurion to intervene, and within a day, the phone company had installed a phone line in Agnon's home in Talpiot, which you can see there today when you go to Beit Agnon, you see the telephone. But as Agnon's health improved, the renewed intimacy faded again, and there were many tensions between Agnon and Gershom. Gershom was tired of publishing Agnon's Eastern European folklore, and he told him to come up with something more suitable for our readers, especially because he knew that sitting in Agnon's desk drawer were new chapters from his novel Shira. Agnon had grievances of his own. Schocken's editors had altered his work, the quality of the paper and the design had deteriorated, and he suspected Gershom of shortchanging him on royalties. Agnon complained to Zalman, but at that stage without much success. For Zalman's 80th birthday, which he celebrated in Scarsdale in 1957, Agnon compiled a special anthology. And at Zalman's funeral, Agnon delivered the eulogy. He said, "You did not inherit from your father great treasures. You did not study at great institutions of learning. Wealth and learning you acquired yourself through will and desire, hard work and diligence." When I was in Germany, Agnon continued, I traveled with the poor in the fourth class compartment of the train, and we overheard women talking about Schocken, that because of Schocken, people who were not rich were able to wear decent clothes. He helped scholars and students do their work without having to worry about income. Anthony David points out that the only thing that Agnon forgot to mention in the eulogy was that his patron had helped transform him from a provincial writer of folk tales, alone and penniless, into an author of world-class epics. Now, I think that Zalman viewed Agnon, viewed himself as Agnon's patron in 5 senses, and I want to look at 5 types of patronage briefly. The first, a material patronage. Agnon was in dire financial circumstances when he met Zalman. Publishers wouldn't take a financial risk on an untested writer. Zalman took on full financial responsibility for him. But his material patronage extended beyond money. He would send Agnon care packages full of socks and shoes and food and soap and toothbrushes. In one letter to Zalman, Agnon wrote, "The shoe size is 38 or 39, the neck size is 39, and please send soft necks, or if they're hard, make them short. I'm also in urgent need of cotton undershirts." Zalman also provided Agnon with practical advice on how to handle matters such as hostile immigration officials. And his letters to Agnon deal with the intricacies of intestinal problems, which Zalman was very familiar with. And he enlisted Leo Herman to supervise Agnon's health. And once he made Leo ensure that Agnon didn't leave the hospital. The second type of patronage was, of course, literary patronage. Long before Agnon became widely known, Zalman said, "I should like to do all I can to promote Agnon's work. He is a great epic writer. I'm of the opinion that the best one can do for the Hebrew language is to enrich it by works of epic prose. I'm not interested in the opinions of readers, but that other Hebrew writers will borrow abundantly from his art." When Zalman decided to enter the publishing business in order to publish Agnon's collected works, their combined perfectionism led to delay after delay in publication. Their letters were filled with the minutiae of printing. Zalman wanted to read every page in the original and had specially formatted translations prepared to allow him to penetrate Agnon's style. Zalman's private secretary did the editing. The director of Zalman's corporate printing department supervised the printing. Zalman was determined to find the right Hebrew font. It disturbed him to see too much space between the words, nor did he like the introduction of unnecessary signs and symbols interrupting the flow of the sentence. He opposed Agnon's attempt to introduce a special mark as a break between chapters. Absolutely not, he wrote. Especially now, it's important to have clarity and avoid all unnecessary symbols. The binding, the paper, the typography were beyond anything that Hebrew readers had ever seen. Chagall and Bialik were ecstatic about the font. As Anthony David puts it, strict aesthetic purity, he hoped, Zalman hoped, would lead Palestine's Jews to dispassionate thinking. And Agnon wrote to him, "Oh, my dearest, blessed friend, the Almighty One desires that you and I rejoice in our labors." When a poor translation of The Bridal Canopy was pulled apart by American reviewers, Haaretz went on the offensive. They published an article entitled, "Agnon, a candidate for the Nobel Prize," and the claim that Agnon is making for himself a career in world literature bound to end in Stockholm. It's amazing, actually, how a newspaper can, create and pave the way for a Nobel to be awarded years later. The Bridal Canopy, of course, was one of the most important novels in any language, is what Haaretz described it. Agnon showed his gratitude by compiling an anthology on the history of Jewish books in honor of Zalman called Book, Author, Story. But his ultimate compliment to Zalman was when he was in bed with severe flu for 7 weeks, he read Faust. And Zalman had, of course, been encouraging him, as we mentioned earlier, to do this for 20 years. And in 1945, Haaretz published a series of Agnon's short stories, including one about the strange culture of the Yekkers of Rehavia, the main figure based on Erich Mendelssohn. As David puts it, to see his writer surreptitiously smuggle the chief architect into a short story, that was Zalman's chief architect, into a short story, gave Zalman particular satisfaction. He only asked himself when he, Agnon's lifetime patron, would get the same treatment. And when Agnon won the Bialik Prize in 1950, Haaretz praised him for lifting up modern Hebrew prose to the pinnacle of great literature. It's hardly surprising.
He won the prize 1966.
You're talking about Nobel.
No.
But the Bialik Prize.
Oh, the Bialik Prize.
The Bialik Prize he won in 1950, and that's when Haaretz praised him. And remember, this is all a lead up to, after Zalman's death, to the Nobel, which we'll come to in a moment. It's hardly surprising that Zalman always called Agnon my writer. Now, we might call the third type of patronage cultural. Zalman went to great lengths to direct Agnon's reading and to mold his cultural outlook. He introduced Agnon to Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Rembrandt, and Rodin. When Agnon was in hospital, Zalman sent him copies of Goethe's Poetry and Truth. Zalman was prescriptive and he was patronizing. He refused Agnon's early requests for books by Strindberg, not because they were viewed as risque, but because he didn't think Agnon was culturally mature enough to read them. And instead, he sent Agnon a package containing the Iliad, Don Quixote, 1001 Arabian Nights, and Finnish epics. And these selections, it's interesting, those 4 selections that he sent him, they reflect Zalman's view that what a mature literature is grounded in is a mythic and epic core. That's what he wanted Agnon to model his writing on. Zalman viewed modern Hebrew as lacking this, and he thought Agnon could play a central role in correcting. As Dan Laor puts it, Zalman saw in Agnon the potential to be a Jewish Homer or Cervantes, who could create a national canon out of traditional Jewish literature. In fact, it took until Agnon was in his 60s for Zalman to deem him mature enough to read Strindberg's plays. He finally sent him a set after Agnon's heart attack in 1951. Zalman also taught Agnon to value books as artifacts. For example, to see in a prayer book not just its religious content, but also the skilled work of a particular printer with a unique style of typography, as well as its particular provenance. And for many years, Agnon worked as Zalman's purchasing agent for Hebrew books, which are found today in the Schocken library. Agnon taught Zalman a great deal about traditional Jewish sources. That was Agnon teaching Zalman. But Zalman felt strongly that Agnon needed to free his writing from religious piety, so he could focus on universal themes and motifs such as myth, character development, philosophy, and landscapes modeled on German culture. At age 80, Zalman was still strident in complaining about the traditionalism of the anthology that Agnon prepared for his birthday. He wrote, Agnon has a completely new plan. His early anthologies were more generally literary, but what he's doing here relates exclusively to the Bible. This gives the book a traditional rabbinic atmosphere that creates a strange tension for a modern man. Each time I pick it up, this is Zalman saying it at age 80, each time I pick it up, I'm forced to put it aside. Anyway, there was also a fourth type of patronage, which was political. Zalman kept close tabs on Agnon's development as a writer, and when Agnon introduced right-wing elements into his stories, he said, for example, he wanted to unmask the Arabs as vicious enemies who talk about peace but always carry a knife. Zalman told him in no uncertain terms that the political taste the stories leave is not a good one. Zalman accused Agnon of being self-righteous and one-sided. He wrote, I'm of the opinion that one should not give a helping hand to those who always portray their own group of people in the best possible light and others in the worst. During the Arab riots in Palestine in the early 1930s, Agnon wrote of despicable Arabs. And he wrote to Zalman, like all Jews, I have never ceased to believe that the land of Israel is ours, and all the other peoples who have been here are guardians until we return. So don't be surprised by what's happened. No one ever thought the Arabs would give us the land without a fight. We came prepared for sorrows and wars. Zalman did not like the sound of it, and he responded with a severe chiding, and he gave Agnon strict orders to keep his political views to himself. Finally, Zalman's patronage, fifth type of patronage of Agnon, was deeply personal, what I call personal patronage. After the initial meeting, Zalman and Agnon quickly developed a close friendship. Early on, Zalman confided in Agnon about his marital problems and his ambivalence towards German Jews. And Agnon treated Zalman as a father figure, as his own father had recently died. Agnon would visit Zalman's family and spend hours in his library. He'd take walks with Zalman's wife Lily in the park. He'd play with Gustav Gershom or teach him Hebrew. And Zalman gave Agnon free rein of his warehouse to select whatever he needed. Although Zalman had many proteges, he would confide in Agnon in ways he would not confide into anybody else. For example, he shared with Agnon his hurt at the condescending slights from Jewish intellectuals, and he told Agnon never to repeat this. Unfortunately, as we've seen in Zalman's final years, when he tried to rekindle their personal relationship, Agnon rebuffed him. Zalman wrote to Agnon, "I would like the two of us to wander once again in the evenings through the streets of the city, just as we once did on hot Berlin nights, and that you will tell me more about your work and your plans that you have had over the last few years." And when Agnon complained about Gershon, Zalman was frank in his response. "Of all the people I've known over the years, no one has been as important to me as you. Our first years were good, and then came a string of years that were now good, now less so. The last stretch of time has been mostly difficult. As Anthony David puts it, the tensions, misunderstandings, sympathy, and antipathy never disappeared from Agnon's relationship with the Schocken family because they were built into it. Agnon frequently felt the need to break out from under Zalman's vast umbrella, but he never did. So let me pause again for a moment before we turn to our final part this evening, where I'll talk about Agnon's view of Schocken. So let me pause here and see if there are any questions about the relationship between Schocken and Agnon.
I am shocked at Schocken. First of all, thanks very much for your wonderful presentation. I'm shocked at Schocken when what did he do? He excised sections from censorship. That's the word I'm looking for. Lo beseder.
I don't know if there was censorship. I don't know, but there was certainly an attempt to mold Agnon's views, his hashkafa, and his writing. And yes, he was putting a muzzle on that. It's interesting, as you say, Aaron, that of course, the whole question of freedom of speech and that Schocken, we kind of associate with Schocken, how the other side of it.
In Yiddish, there's a saying, "Der was hat the mayor, hat the day." Whoever has the money has. Okay.
Well, this is actually a very good segue to our last, let's jump into this, to Agnon's view of Schocken, because that's where we get to the complicated relationship here. And we'll start with the Nobel Prize. When it was announced in 1966, Agnon did not mention Zalman in his public comments. Of course, Zalman had already passed away before the award ceremony, and as a result, Gershom did not attend the Nobel ceremony. Now, in the acceptance speech at the ceremony, Agnon described Zalman as the man who had published his collected works in Leipzig, but he said nothing about his 40-year patronage of Agnon. And the question is, how did Agnon feel about that patronage in all its dimensions? Appreciation, gratitude, acceptance, embarrassment, oppression, resentment. As in any complex relationship, perhaps there's a mix of all these feelings. Now, rather than speculate, let's take a brief look for some clues in Agnon's final posthumous novel, In Mr. Lublin's Store. Now, I know there's some, Shoshana and I had some communication on this whole question of describing Mr. Lublin's Store as his final novel, because it was not published during his life. But it was the final novel published in both Hebrew and in English. In English translation, it was only published in 2016, very recently. It's a wonderful translation by Professor Glenda Abramson, Landsman of mine from South Africa at Oxford, and edited by Jeffrey Sachs. And parts of the novel had been published, in Hebrew in Haaretz and in other publications during the 1960s. But the whole novel was compiled after Agnon's death by Agnon's daughter, Emuna Yaron, from various written pieces in Agnon's files, and it was published in Hebrew as a whole in 1974. And there's a note at the end of the English translation where Emuna explains her process, and she concludes it, since we have not been fortunate enough to have my father edit his book, I did the best I could with what I had without correcting, changing, or adding anything. Now, it's Friday afternoon in Leipzig during the First World War, and the narrator, who's referred to in the novel as being Agnon, is on his way to purchase food for Shabbat. But he runs into Mr. Arno Lublin, the wealthy owner of a mail order company. You know, I imagine him with something like a First World War German Jewish Jeff Bezos. You know, this was the Amazon of Leipzig. Mr. Lublin had an urgent appointment, and the narrator agrees to mind the store. The store contains no books, magazines, or newspapers. Mr. Lublin has disconnected the telephone, so the narrator would not be disturbed. Thus, the narrator occupies himself with his imagination, reflecting on his experiences since coming to Germany, where he lived in Berlin and then moved to Leipzig. He compares these cities and the German Jewish community to his hometown in Galicia, which is also Mr. Lublin's hometown. And he doesn't name it, but we can assume it's Buchach. The narrator's wide-ranging reflections cover history, fantasy, romance, dreams, and adventure, all infused with philosophical, theological, and sociological observation, literary allusion, halakha, and agada, and much pathos, irony, and, of course, humor. For example, Mr. Lublin says, why do people who have devoted all their strength to Germany and helped extend its borders through their activities and who work their entire lives for the good of Germany worry that their sons will abandon Judaism? In fact, how much of Judaism have they preserved themselves that gives them the right to worry about their children abandoning it? When I consider my wife's family, I realize that they are not as worried about their children abandoning Judaism as about the non-Jewish woman their children bring home. We don't have the time here to explore the many fascinating aspects of this not particularly well-known novel, which warrants at least a full session, if not a series of sessions. And I'm going to focus on what Agnon's treatment of Lublin suggests about his complicated feelings about the model on which this character appears to be based, Zalman Schocken. Like Zalman, Lublin is a product of simple, poor, and pious roots in Eastern Europe. He left home at an early age. He took nothing with him. He wandered from village to village and city to city. Eventually, he ends up in Saxony, where he works at a store owned by a relative, and he rises from errand boy to Leipzig's most successful entrepreneur. He succeeds because, unlike the more established merchants in the city, he changes with the times. Now, Chaim Be'er argues that the key to unlocking this novel, and by the way, Agnon's Adhena, which is often twinned with it, is the conspicuous absence of the Jewish bookshelf, what he calls the conspicuous absence of the Jewish bookshelf. Lublin's store contains no books whatsoever. Lublin is not a reader or a theater goer. He says to the narrator, if the play is short, like all modern plays whose virtue is brevity, we won't have to wait long for the meal. In the novel's final chapter, the acculturated Lublin is contrasted with Jacob Stern. Stern symbolizes the old world values of the narrators and Lublin's Galician hometown. What Agnon, what the narrator keeps referring to as our town. The narrator notes that Stern respects books like all Jews, which is ironic because Lublin does not. But he also says that Stern considers our town's power to be greater than that of any book. In other words, Stern has transcended the love of books as artifacts and respects them for the traditions and the wisdom that they contain and represent. The narrator talks to Stern about the prospect of a Hebrew university being established in Jerusalem, and then he reflects on its implications. Lectures will be in Hebrew. All the students will be graduating from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem will know Hebrew, among them doctors, and naturally they'll become used to writing prescriptions in Hebrew because even the pharmacists will know Hebrew. Is there a better vision than this in all the world? Again, the narrator's observation is ironic because this vision is not ennobling, but transactional. And by reducing the purpose of a Hebrew university to the facilitation of pharmaceutical prescriptions, points to the potential debasement of the holy language. The narrator notes that people who are not thought of highly in our town made names for themselves out in the world once they left. He says, the world is split, the rest of the world on one side, our town on the other. And the generations are split into those that preceded Jacob Stern and those that followed him. Agnon is suggesting that Lublin was of the fallen generation that succeeded Stern. He may have made a name for himself in Leipzig, but may not measure up to the more exacting standards of the old world. And he's unable to defend Lublin because Lublin had cut himself off from the world of his forefathers. As the narrator puts it, even a Gentile who was born in our town and left couldn't live in peace until he returned. However, Mr. Lublin never returned since the day he fled, as if his feet has never stood in our town, as if he had never smelt its earth. The narrator says to Stern, whenever I think of our town, I imagine that nothing has changed since the 6 days of creation. But our town is far from perfect. A great many Jews from our town went to other towns and countries because they couldn't find anything to do. Some of them exchanged poverty for poverty, while others achieved what they couldn't have in our town. And the narrator continues, our town is difficult, as are its inhabitants. They dislike anyone advancing himself above the other towns. Naked and barefoot, Mr. Lublin left our town, and now he is wealthy and respected. Finally, we discover that this Stern is in fact dead, and the narrator has been dreaming. And then, at the end of the novel, the narrator's eyes are filled with tears because he says, I dreamt I had seen my father, my teacher. I greeted him, but he didn't return my greeting because he was in mourning. I asked him, Father, why are you in mourning? Who are you mourning? He said, you, my son, I'm mourning for you. I said to him, this mourning's over. Even I have forgotten when I die. And he replied in his amazement, over? If this is so, we are allowed to now study Torah. And he stretched out his hand toward the bookcase and took down a volume of Maimonides' Code of Law. And then the narrator says, I thought, not in a dream but awake as I was sitting in Mr. Lublin's store, if this is the case, the day has not been wasted. I'll study one or two laws from Maimonides' book. The passage about his father and about this vision he has captures the narrator's fear and frustration in wasting the Friday afternoon in Mr. Lublin's store, which, by the way, happens to be Maimonides' yahrzeit. He's wasted it because he failed to study. As Be'er puts it, the father believes with all his heart in the eternal power of the Jewish bookshelf and the vibrancy of the world of the old Beit Midrash. He mourns for his son, whose distance from the books on the shelf and from the study of their treasures causes a death sentence to be passed on our narrator. The book's translator, Glenda Abramson, links this death with technology. In the novel's technological world, the telephone interferes with man's rest and tranquility. The theater offers its audience licentiousness. Submarines that represent all the technology of warfare are under the sea, they lurk there, and newspapers replace the biblical text. Despite all his efforts, the narrator does not find the reconciliation he's seeking between the old world and the new, Torah and literature, Leipzig and Jerusalem. One can only imagine what Agnon would have made of today's technology-obsessed world. The novel concludes with the sentence, "Here, in these places, people still honor a lie, but where our ancestors lie, the lie has lost its charm." The point is that the narrator, in committing to modernity by remaining in Lublin's sterile, book-free store with Shabbat approaching, was deeply anxious about dying a spiritual and cultural death. Compared to the creative, powerful, and vibrant old world, modernity has brought sterility, impotence, and death. The former, the old world, is socially cohesive, culturally deep, and founded on family, faith, piety, and learning. The latter is fragmented, alienating, and superficial, founded on materialism, technology, transactions, and commerce. So, is this the doomed modernity that Agnon associates with his patron, Zalman Schocken? Dan Laor has called Mr. Lublin a reincarnation of Zalman Schocken. Can we substitute Zalman for Lublin in this sorry depiction of a successful modern man? There is not a simple correspondence. On one hand, like Lublin, Zalman was a prosperous, self-made, and self-contained storekeeper, an energetic entrepreneur who moved from an eastern shtetl to Germany and adapted to modernity, a youthful, modern, acculturated, assimilated, what he calls errant son. On the other hand, there are many nuanced contrasts. Lublin was well liked. Zalman was difficult and somewhat unpopular. Lublin was highly respected. Zalman was admired, but snubbed and rejected. Lublin was elegant. Zalman was somewhat coarse. Lublin was impeccably honest. Zalman was somewhat manipulative. Lublin symbolized German-Jewish cooperation, and Zalman, of course, was exiled from Germany. Hence, the complexity of the Agnon-Schocken relationship. In making Arno Lublin tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, was Agnon poking fun at Zalman, who was short, dark, and stocky? Was he using irony to suggest that Zalman's assimilationist aspirations were doomed? One is reminded of the assimilationist German-Jewish philosopher Hermann Cohen, who said that he looked forward to future generations of blonde, Germanic-looking Jews. And yet, Agnon's narrator feels close to Mr. Lublin, and not to anyone else in Leipzig. As he puts it, not because he made it possible for me to live in Leipzig, not because he is from my town. It's because Lublin is something of a non-novelty, a man who was born in our town and then excised it from his heart and doesn't remember it fondly, if he remembers it at all. Clearly, Agnon is attracted by modernity and the possibility of forgetting the traditions of his forefathers, or at least Agnon's narrator in the book is. And the narrator's primary expertise is a specialist in, for those who've read it, a specialist in clothing. He's written a major book about garments. On one hand, Agnon has difficulty defending Lublin. On the other, he shows affection for and identification with him. And then, with added irony, the narrator comments, I like certainty and not something that resembles something else. And again, he says, I hate analysis and prefer simplicity. Thus, Agnon highlights his ambivalence toward both Lublin and Schocken. In the middle of the novel, the narrator reflects, I go in and out of his house, but I know nothing about him apart from what he has taught me. I know nothing about him apart from what he has taught me. Thus, the narrator's knowledge of Lublin is wholly derived from Lublin's description of himself. Is Agnon perhaps hinting that his knowledge and our knowledge of Zalman Schocken is based solely on the image that Zalman contrived and promoted? And this is doubly ironic because that would apply equally to our knowledge of Agnon himself. I think Anthony David's unfair when he calls this novel in Mr. Lublin's Store a baffling melange of tedium, false and suffocating reality. It has no action, no dialogue, not even a coherent stream of ideas or scenes. Hardly a masterpiece. The book has never attracted many readers, and almost no scholars have shown much interest. It's ironic that Anthony David's own book has been criticized, as I mentioned earlier, among other things, for its inaccuracies. And one of those inaccuracies is that he confused Gershom Schocken's daughter, who he said compiled the novel, with Agnon's daughter, Imuna Yaron, who in fact compiled. And actually, I think I copied you, Shoshan, on a correspondence. Email I wrote to Anthony David and to Jeffrey Sachs, and Jeffrey, of course, confirmed this, but we haven't heard back yet from Anthony. Actually, it's a very fascinating book, but David is correct in pointing out that the novel reflects the ambivalent feelings that the writer had for his patron. And he also says that these feelings were picked up and expanded on by Zalman Schocken's son Gershom, who described the Lublin-Zalman character as the quintessential modern man. He does not come from the city and its traditions, says Gershom, and he has no moral qualms about overturning all rules and putting other merchants out of business who are less adept at the new intellectual and business trends. Interesting comment on his father. So, to conclude, what does Zalman's relationship with Agnon mean for Zalman's legacy? Well, Zalman once told Agnon, financial profits aren't enough to move a heart like mine. I will consider myself a success if I'm able to participate in the labor and culture of the nation using the experience acquired through my work. Did Zalman achieve this success? I think Professor Steve Asheim at the Hebrew University sums it up especially well. In an age of total war, genocide, and extreme nationalism, he writes, there was something outmoded, anachronistic in Zalman's continued insistence upon melding Enlightenment classicism and humanism with the treasures of Jewish tradition. Yet even if he tilted against some windmill, he built a few of his own. And some of these institutions have more or less stood the test of time. The publishing houses in New York and Tel Aviv, and above all, as Irving pointed out earlier, the liberal Israeli daily Haaretz, continue to articulate this message. Valiantly, they keep alive that bygone synthesis of European and Jewish cultural humanism in a world too often deaf to its cadences. I would suggest, just as Zalman's idealism set him up for disappointment in his other spheres of interest and influence, so his idealism about his relationship with Agnon set him up for some disappointment there. And yet, just as his legacy in business, in culture, and in Jewish and Zionist affairs is filled with success, so is the legacy of his complex relationship with Agnon. Anthony David compared Zalman's relationships with his own son, Gershom, and his protege, Agnon. He said, having been deeply influenced and crippled by him, by Zalman, in equal measure, both Gershom and Agnon understood how his stubborn humanism, his individualism, and his lack of human intimacy were the source of his genius and his flaws. Gershom wrote, "My father's greatest achievement with regard to modern Hebrew literature was that he provided for S.Y. Agnon for over 40 years. And Gershom's son Amos, now the publisher of Haaretz, as we mentioned, makes this comment about his grandfather Zalman in Naomi Shuri's film. He said, no doubt the meeting between Agnon and Zalman Schocken was a miracle for Agnon. This is my translation, by the way, the movie is in Hebrew. No doubt the meeting between Agnon and Zalman Schocken was a miracle for Agnon. It's not possible to say that without Zalman, there wouldn't be Agnon, but perhaps the form and range and order of magnitude that we know of Agnon wouldn't be there. We began with David's remark that Zalman became an infrequent footnote in scholarly monographs dealing with the history of German Jews. David may have understated the available material on Schocken when he wrote that, and his own book and a variety of subsequent materials have gone some way toward highlighting Zalman Schocken's legacy. But that legacy warrants far more attention. And a key part of Zalman Schocken's legacy is his profound and complex impact on the life and work of Shmuel Yosef Agnon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Steve, I just want to know when you're coming back with another presentation. It's just fantastic. Yeah.